Cancel one. Okay. Let's see how this works. And if I say something, you can hear me? Slow mode is on. What does that mean? Okay, then that's working. Still getting used to this stuff. Let's see if I can put that in the chat later. Can you copy if I send something in the chat? Can you copy it? Use the link for the Zoom. If that works, I can do it at the end, and then Swords the movie can join on Zoom. Okay. Now we just wait for some more people coming. Seems to be at 5. Hello, hello. We still have 3 minutes, still 2 minutes in the meantime, till I'm supposed to start. I'm still getting used to the not seeing part of it. It's like I'm talking to myself. I should say, I'm butterfly. It's just 1 minute ago now, according to my information on my laptop. Yeah, I saw that you posted it. Oh, you never know this is going to work. Can always sing a song next time to attract more people. There's Richard as well. I have a crowd of 4. That's not bad. But it's always nice to learn new things and start playing with them. Of course, it's all very un-Heideggerian to work with this kind of technology, but Heidegger can still land in the 21st century as well. So, oh, just going up the number. So I'll just wait 2 or 3 minutes longer, and then if somebody has a question, you can already start typing if you want, so I can think about an answer for a minute. Yes, my children are very proud of me. I'm now a YouTuber, so I'm a serious person. They will talk to me again. Well, I'm going up to 8, so. Well, there's a. Okay, let's see. What do I think of is the relation between the thought of Heidegger and Rosenzweig? I think there's more a matter of Rosenzweig reading Heidegger and thinking about Heidegger than Heidegger really getting into Rosenzweig. So I would say that I must also admit that I'm not very well versed in Rosenzweig's work. But as far as Heidegger is concerned, I don't think there's an influence of Rosenzweig in Heidegger. Hello, Francesco. So I hope that answers your question, Rima. Heidegger probably read his Hegel book and also the Star of Redemption. And maybe in his later work in the 50s, 60s, he might have gone back to Rosenzweig through the influence of Martin Buber, who he met at the time. And they seem to be getting along pretty well. So, but I don't have the complete answer at hand. I would need to do some research on it. It's kind of weird, this talking to people who you can't see. With Zoom, you can see people, but this is a little bit different. But if anybody has another question, feel free to post something. It can be on Heidegger, it can be on maybe something you're working on yourself, or a question you may have about research and things. If you were trapped on a desert island, well, if I were trapped on the island, I would probably not have taken the Heidegger book with me, because if I knew beforehand that I would get trapped on a desert island, I probably would take the Vorträge and Aufsätze. I think there's a lot of stuff in there that I like. So it would probably be the book I would take with me. And you have a little bit of everything. You have the interpretation of the history of metaphysics, you have the interpretation of poetry, you have thinking about technology, and you also have some of the better essays, I think, on early Greek thinking. So you could spend a long time on there, on that kind of stuff. Other option would be on the way to language. But I think I would prefer Vorträge and Aufsätze, although there's no complete English translation of it. So I will have to make do with the German. I think Yeah, there's a difference between the early and the later Heidegger concerning the other. I think that Heidegger would say, even if you're encountering the other, that would be a moment of being with. And this being with uh, oh, sorry, that's my son who intervened for a minute. Kids. Uh, so you can only encounter the other in the world. So I think Heidegger would say you still need to do this analytic of Dasein if you want to understand the possibility of meeting the other, and this being in the world would for Heidegger be primary to the meeting of the other. And the first person you really meet in your life is your mother. That's the first other that you encounter, and that's a special relationship, of course, because you're growing within her body. So. And if the other would be the complete other, so then you would probably not be able to recognize it. You have to have a moment of identity in this relationship. I think that's one of the strong points of Heidegger, that he's basically always focusing on the identity of identity and difference. That makes it that offers a lot of possibilities to develop his thinking further, I think. Hearing my thoughts on Heidegger's lectures on Milton's hymns in the Rhine. Wow. They're of course very interesting lectures. We gave the course in winter semester 34-35, and it's kind of in between. It's the moment where it's moving away, you could say, from politics in quotation marks. I suppose you know that in '33 he was director of the University of Freiburg, and he was, let's say, he saw a lot of positive possibilities in National Socialism, which later turned out to be a big mistake. He starts to distance himself from thinking about politics, that you find in especially in '33, '34, and move to art. And of course, if you think about art, that opens up a whole new realm of being that he didn't pay any attention to in Being in Time, for example. Being in Time, you only have the Vorhandenheit, being present at hand, and being ready at hand, and the work of art cannot be understood in either mode. So that also means that Heidegger has to rethink the structure of Dasein, basically, and make it possible for a work of art to be experienced. And in '35, he's also writing his famous lecture on the origin of the work of art. So that's where Heidegger starts opening up. A big theme in both these courses is in this course is that still the place of the homeland, and that he tries to develop from Hölderlin. In itself, that's already interesting, because it's not a normal subject matter for a professor of philosophy in Germany at the time to work on Hölderlin's hymns, especially the late ones. Okay. Okay, I'll do Richard first, and then I'll go to Ceylon. And Being in Time, Heidegger refers to Pascal. Well, the questions are going fast now, so I have to reply pretty quick. I have two-part question. What was the relationship between Pascal and Heidegger? I think that, of course, there's only a relationship. Heidegger did read Pascal, that we know for sure. There's very little he actually has to say about Pascal. He never did a seminar on Pascal or a course, which is an interesting thing to see. Pascal is also a kind of antidote to Descartes, you might say. So I think what he gets from Pascal, which he says explicitly in Gelassenheit, is this notion of hetzhaftes thinking, that we translate it hetzhaft, heartfelt, hearty thinking, not the cold thinking of logic that he already mentions in his very early writings, not the calculative thinking of modern science, but it's the opening up. It has to do with, I think, with disposedness, Befindlichkeit. I think there is this relation, especially in the later Heidegger, between how we find ourselves in relation to all the entities that we encounter, and that the basis of it is no longer this Zuhandenheit or this ready at hand that he makes so strong in being in time, but the kind of being attuned with. I think it's in this notion of hetzhaft. So we're more open and more willing to listen to beings addressing us and not so much projecting our understanding of what beings are supposed to be onto beings. And I must admit, I don't know Pascal well enough to answer your second question based on what I know. So I need to catch up on my Pascal. Yes, the art is in structure being in time, art can play a role. So then we get to Celan. That's also a complex story, I think, Heidegger and Celan. I think Heidegger was admired Celan and his poetry. Then again, the interesting thing is that we hardly have anything in writing with Heidegger on Celan, although we read his volumes of poetry intensely. And Ceylon was, I think, also interested on a serious level with Heidegger. He had several copies of Heidegger's works that he annotated, etc. And when he came to Freiburg to read his poetry, and Heidegger went to the reading of his poetry, and they met later, and Heidegger invited him to come to his cabin, and Celan accepted the invitation. Later, he wrote his famous poem Tot naar Berg, and I think he was hoping for an answer from Heidegger that Heidegger did not give him, and that was, I think, a disappointment for Celan. And yeah, that's been recently reading okay for Heidegger, etc. I think if you want to meet the other as the other, you still have this moment of identity. Even if you, let's say, you meet your creator, who is infinitely different from me, there still has to be this moment of identity. Otherwise, you cannot. There will be no encounter. Yes, you. I think the Totenberg poem is a really deep one. And, you can spend a lot of time thinking about it. It's also Heidegger's relation to people in France. Another example is René Char, with whom Heidegger became very friendly, and he was also in the resistance in France. So with Heidegger's background as being the director of the university during the period of the Nazi dictatorship or Nazi dictatorship, was not uh, was not playing a big role for René Char, or he talked about it with Heidegger, and he came to the conclusion that he could live with it. That's kind of interesting also in this whole debate that's been going on for such a long time since publication of the Black Notebooks, that people like Hannah Arendt, who met Heidegger in the 50s again after a long time, was very critical of Heidegger, made up with him. Carl Lewitt is the same story. And also people like René Char, for example, and even Viktor Frankl, who was himself a survivor of Auschwitz. He and Heidegger met in Vienna when Heidegger was giving a lecture and also participating in a seminar by Leo Gabriel. And there developed also a friendly relationship. So we'll be publishing some of the few letters that are still available in the Heidegger yearbook probably later this year or early next year. I think they are relevant for this whole discussion. The star on the top of the whale in the poem. Let's see, there is one of the stars is in the Heidegger Museum. There were 7 or 8, because they're out in the rain and the snow and the sun, so they break up. So you need to replace them every 10 years or so. Since the cabin has been there this month for 100 years, you can imagine that over that period of time there have been 7 different stars, I think. There's not one at the moment. Last time I was at the cabin, there was no star in the Brunerstock, as they call it, where the water comes from that fills the beam that's standing before it. And then the next one. That's a good question, Louise. Do you see Heidegger scholarship everything possible beyond the Black Notebooks, revelations? Well, the interesting thing I think is about the Black Notebook revelations is they're not so revealing. I think there's not that much in it that you cannot find already in earlier texts or letters of Heidegger. It also depends on the way how you're going to interpret it. And that's still it's a general question about Heidegger scholarship. How do you deal with the different kinds of writings we have? First of all, you have to publish the writings that Heidegger published himself. So that's could say this the first and most important source of our knowledge of Heidegger thinking, because he published it himself and was satisfied with the way he had worked it out in his publication. And then there's of course you have these manuscripts that he used for his lecture courses. There are a lot that are completely written out, and there are also quite a few where it's more like Stichwörter, so just small notes and words that he could fall back on while he was developing the lecture course freely as he was giving it. So there is it's basically a reliable source, but I think you still should read it from the published writings and not the other way around. And then we have the manuscripts that he didn't publish, like contributions to philosophy. There, the texts are pretty. Heidegger worked on them several times, so he's prototyped the manuscript, and they would control the wording and make corrections together when Heidegger was staying with him in a long time. So there's that's another thing, and then you have of course letters. And I think what somebody says privately in a letter is not something that you would be happy to publish, because it's supposed just to be between the two people who are corresponding with each other. And something we all know. I don't think anybody of us would like all our emails that we send over the years. I must have sent more than 30,000. Become available to the people that we sometimes talk about. And if you would talk about somebody knowing that it would be public, they might phrase things a little bit differently. So I think in Heidegger's case, there's also a reason to be cautious, to look at who he's talking to at what point, and not to give it too much value sometimes. And then, of course, we still have the seminars and his preparation notes for it, and we have the black notebooks, which is, of course, another form of writing. And I think we started interpreting the black notebooks before asking any of these hermeneutical questions. And I think that's a way of getting past it. First, there are some very disturbing remarks about Jewish people, Judaism. But you find also some very strange remarks about Catholicism, for example. So, I think it will be hard to get over Heidegger. We need to rebuild Heidegger scholarship in Germany, I think. It's too much tainted now by this, in my opinion, overreaction to the publication of the Black Notebooks. But that's what people know now, and that's what they think when they hear the name Heidegger. I hope if I publish my biography that it might help a little bit to open up another perspective, and that people see that in some cases you have to be more careful. And the historical situation, of course, very different in 1932 compared to what we know now and the way we think about things now. I hope it will be possible. It's also a reason for the different archives that exist now. There's one in Meskirch, there's one in Seville, where people can still go and study and read Heidegger and work on his thinking. So I think that's a way to go. I'll stop on this topic then. If I'm invited to the Collège de France to give a 3 o'clock program between French and German research on Heidegger today, if I were invited to such an honorable place, as Collège de France, I would probably start thinking for 3 hours before saying anything. So I think the main difference is, to put it very simple, that the German research on Heidegger started on the basis of being in time. And in France, it started on the basis of the letter of humanism. So it's, and of course, through also the relationships and friendships that existed between Heidegger and people like Beaufray, Nietzsche, and some others, and Sartre, Levinas, who both heard Heidegger. I think the focus was in France on the later Heidegger. Maybe you could say that they discovered being a time later. It was translated much later. And so in just the two sentences, I would probably develop it along those lines. And of course, the political played a role also in the reception of Heidegger from the beginning. There were Heidegger critics in France as well, especially with respect to his politics in quotation marks. What is going on? Well, that's a good question. I think what Heidegger would make of what has become of his work. I think the most important thing for Heidegger, maybe it's an anecdote that I can tell. When I started doing seminars in Neskirch, one of the people who would come to most of the seminars was Heidegger's son, even his biological son, Jörg Heidegger. And he told me several times that this gathering of a group of people who would be discussing and focusing on the text of Heidegger and trying to understand it and help each other understand it better was something that his father would have liked very much. Well, I think it's maybe the way I try to do my own seminars always is I'm not so much interested what I think myself is in the text. I think the most important thing I can contribute is to open up the text so you can read it for yourself or have some maybe some tools for reading it better. I think this idea of the workshop that Heidegger talks about regularly all his life is a bit similar to it. It's like going to a carpenter and learning from the carpenter how to make a table, for example, by making a table with him. So that's I think that's the part that Heidegger would like. I'm pretty sure he would dislike people who speak about this philosophy as if it is philosophy. Heidegger would say, "I'm not a philosopher, I'm a thinker." And what he offers us is the possibility to learn how to think for ourselves. And he could do it, of course, more easily in a live seminar with students or with other people than through his writings. And I think his writings can be a great way to learn how to think. It's how you learn. It's similar to becoming a painter. If you want to become a painter, usually you work with for a number of years with somebody who's already an established painter, and you learn from his way of being a painter what it means to be a painter, and you can become your own painter in your own right. So that's why in the state of, as long as the books are not read, it's empty. It's like music. If there's the composition but nobody is playing the music, there's no point. And I think if I would have had the chance to talk with Heidegger before he died about the future of his work, I would have insisted that the most important thing is that it remains alive, that it becomes accessible, and that you, in a sense, you can play with it. I think there should be much more playful dealing with Heidegger's text and books than is there usually is the case. It's not so much. Heidegger is using formal indications always, and they are not definitions. And people usually mistake them for definitions, and if you do that, then the whole thing becomes dead. It's about the letter, not the spirit. Let's see. Yes, I think there is no cause for the ontological difference, I would say. I would say that basically it's what it gives. I think that's where Heidegger starts from already from the beginning. It gives. What it gives for the early Heidegger is this meaningful world, which is ordered and where we can understand things and see it. And in a sense, he keeps that perspective his whole life. But for you could say he's asking for the condition of possibility for something being given. And phenomenology itself is based on something being given. It's not constructing, but it's intuiting, but it's given. There, I would say the ontological difference is a movement. It's the understanding that being. I think in English the problem is that we use the word beings or entities. In German, it's das Sein. And das Sein, there can be a being, concrete being, but it can also be that what is. So if you talk about beings in that sense, then the whole of all the beings is that what is. And this what is, in this is, being comes to light. But being is always more than any given entity. So that's where you get a feel for the ontological difference. And of course, later in the notion of the history of being, you can see that it's already in being and time in the sense that there are two meanings of Dasein. I think that's very important to keep in mind. One is that Dasein is a universal structure of the existentialis. But this existential structure of Dasein is valid, or you can find in the being of all human beings throughout history and on this planet. So that's, but it's only there, this structure, in its concrete individualization, as J. Meining is. So you can disclose it, but you can only disclose it from your own facticity, from your own Dasein. That's why Heidegger is using formal indication. He's pointing you into the direction where you can find these structures and you can actualize them yourself. The voorlauf zum Tode, being towards death, is something that you can experience in your own existence. Let's see. So that will be that one. Let's see. Innocent questions are always good questions. I always say there are only good questions, there are only dumb answers. So if I give a dumb answer, please say so in the chat. Do you see a general doesn't have possible? I think there is the interest in Heidegger is always still there, and it's not just in younger people. There's also a readership, let's say, of people aged over 50 who are interested in Heidegger and in thinking, and often they come from the later Heidegger because they read the Veldweg, the Country Paths, or they read Gelassenheit, or his question concerning technology, which are accessible texts to a large extent for non-professional philosophers, if philosophy can be a profession at all. But the problem for younger students is that if you want to, it's getting more and more difficult to get any funding for Heidegger research projects. So the DAAD, the German Deutsche Auslandaustauschdienst or whatever, where you can apply normally if you live in Brazil or you live in Japan to get money to stay for 3 months, 6 months, maybe 1 or 2 years in Germany and work on a dissertation. That money is almost dried up. And if you go to the other big ones like Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, it's getting more and more difficult to get any funding for work on Heidegger if it's not to prove that Heidegger was a Nazi. So that's, I think, what makes it harder for younger students. But it's always nice to meet them, and I've been meeting them also through the things I'm doing on the internet the last few years. And in some countries it's a bit easier. In Spain and Latin America, there's not this complete condemnation of Heidegger that you find in Germany and the US, I think, and even in France at the moment. So think how can you keep it alive? I know some of my friend Walker has several doctoral students who did a dissertation or are doing it under his supervision, who have other jobs. One is a teacher at the gymnasium, so he's not dependent on for earning his keep on philosophy. So in that sense, he has more free possibility to study Heidegger and work on it in the way he thinks is appropriate. But it's maybe one of the nice things about Zoom is that you can say, oh, I'm going to spend 2 hours a week with a group of people where we talk about Heidegger, where we read the text together, and it may help you to continue working on Heidegger. What's Fichte's contribution to the young Heidegger? Well, I think Fichte's contribution to the young Heidegger is pretty important. For one thing, Fichte is the source of this notion of facticity. Schelling later uses a word I like in German, it's unvordenklich. So it's something that you cannot think something before. It's the given, facticity. That's where Heidegger starts in 1919, is this facticity. And how it's given to me in my own facticity. Fichte is of course important for Heidegger's understanding also through neo-Kantianism, which was influenced by Fichte as well. This notion of philosophy as a primal science. You find that especially strong in, let's say, in Heidegger's working out of his own position from 1919 on until it still plays a role in being in time in this notion of fundamental ontology. And he gives it up, let's say, more or less in his first lecture course in Freiburg in 28, where he explicitly says that philosophy is not a science, it's something different. So I've written on Heidegger and the young Heidegger and Fichte a couple of papers. To what extent is or isn't science a philosophical anthropology? I think it's not a philosophical anthropology because it's Dasein's analytic. It's this working out of the existential structure of Dasein, which you could say, to use a Kantian phrase, it's a condition of possibility of anthropology. That's what Heidegger himself says several times, and also in Being in Time he already says it, and then he repeats it also in the early 1930s when philosophical anthropology is becoming so important. So before you can do a philosophical anthropology, which is a science of a limited realm of being, because you're only talking about human beings, but that you still need the existential analytic to be laying the ground for what could be a philosophical anthropology. And of course, in Dasein is thinking about this is also this relation to be. Yes, what Maas is saying replies also to the question of human. Looking forward, what is your primary role as a Heidegger researcher? What do you want to continue? Well, for the next 8 years. I'm not so sure I want to be a researcher. I'm more like to be to think along with Heidegger. In a sense, it's similar to doing research, maybe, or uncovering stuff. Since I'm trying to write a biography, you need to do research and find hidden sources and things that were not published, etc. But it's the danger of doing Heidegger research is that you objectify Heidegger thinking. into something which is dead, and you can't give a definite answer what's in the book, for example. I think the most important thing, for me, with Heidegger, is that you try to go along with him on his path of thinking, and that's something I've been working on now for quite a few years, to be honest. And I would like to continue that. I'm now in this path of thinking 3, which will run until 1938. But I would like to go on and go through the whole of Heidegger's path of thinking. So first of all, to the end of 1944, and then Heidegger's late thinking that already starts around that time and becomes public through the Letter of Humanism in the first place. It's further developed over in his other lectures and essays and publications. And there are, of course, also interesting questions concerning the lecture courses that Heidegger published himself. He did Introduction to Metaphysics. He did this the question concerning the thing about Kant, and he did Schelling's treatise on human freedom. So why did he choose those 3? And of course, there's Nietzsche, which is a chapter to itself. It's very well. So in a sense, what Louise is saying, a guide maybe. Try to be guided by Heidegger thinking, and open up clearings for people to get something out of it. For me, it's about getting people to think for themselves, understand something for themselves. It's not so much about what I think Heidegger is saying. It's more about what you think Heidegger is saying, or what you can take from Heidegger in a sense, and develop further in your own thinking or in your own understanding of philosophy and the issue of philosophy. Let's see. Heidegger read Lorca as well. Yes, he did. Of course, he couldn't read Spanish. That's as with Kierkegaard. That's the reason why he never gets into it, because Heidegger will only do seminars and interpretations of poets and philosophers or thinkers, whatever you want to call Kierkegaard, if you can read it in the original language. So that makes the case of Pascal interesting, because he could read Pascal in French, but he couldn't read Lorca in the original. But he liked to give volumes of Lorca's poetry also to his lady friends, to put it that way. So, and if he gives something, a book, as a gift, he's read the book. I've read some T.S. Eliot, I must admit, but it's back in my grey past. I should be doing it again, probably. I think that would be, for me, that's an interesting thing. If you know Eliot's work pretty well, and you think there are resonates with some of Heidegger's thinking, then it would be interesting to develop some thoughts on it. It's in a way, it's what I mean by more playful. If you do Heidegger and Hölderlin, there's a huge amount of text by Heidegger on Hölderlin. But there are these hidden influences that Heidegger doesn't mention or doesn't talk about. And it can also be a creative way of thinking Heidegger further, or even think against Heidegger, which is perfectly all right with me. Yeah, I go down the list and let's see, come to Rima. How do you think Heidegger can spend some subversion? Well, I think it's difficult to answer the question, I think. I don't think that Heidegger influenced Celan. I think in his writing of poetry, he was probably independent. But from And influence of Celan on Heidegger thinking is not very clear there. So I can't imagine that Celan gave a lecture on Heidegger. I haven't heard about it, but it's something to look up. I don't have the answer, I must admit, to that question. I will be dealing more intensely with Celan as I get along with my path of thinking. Gottfried Benn is also someone that Heidegger appreciated and was critical of, where we find very little about Benn. There are few remarks on Benn in Heidegger's work, but there's very few. I'll say something about. I think, well, it depends on scholarship. Depends also on the country. So if you look at the English-speaking scholarship, there's of course a big difference. If you take let's say the first generation of American scholarship on Heidegger, then you have of course you have Richardson, but you also have Xi, and then you have Kizil, who all worked intensely on Heidegger, who all studied also in Germany, who all were in Heidelberg, and they could still. Richardson, of course, himself met Heidegger in person, so that's already something that today is no longer possible. And Kizil and Sheehan, I'm not sure if they met him in person, probably not, a little bit later. But they could still talk to Gadamer, for example. The difference there is also that they knew German really well, so they could write in German, they could translate German into English, they could speak in German. And I think that's something that's been lost in the generations after. I think someone like Polt, for example, cannot write in German. He can translate Heidegger as he did. He can read Heidegger and understand Heidegger, but he doesn't have this ability anymore. And I think that makes it more difficult. I've been working a lot with English translations because a lot of the stuff I'm doing now is in English. And you always run into the problem of the translation. So there's always a need to go back to the German text, and we come across a lot of examples of translations that are basically wrong or nonsensical or need a lot of clarification. So there's a lot of things you can do in German with words that you can't do in English. And Heidegger likes to play and that kind of thing. I think maybe that's a good thing. There's a playful side to Heidegger as well. Most people don't see and don't get, but so that's something. Oh, Richard likes it. So. Where would you begin with Heidegger? I would always begin with Heidegger himself. And there are, for an English-speaking person, that depends whether you're a student of philosophy or so you know more about the context, or you know a little bit about what Heidegger may be talking about, or if you're just reading Heidegger for your pleasure or information, or in German it's easier because they're. I think Gelassenheit is still probably the good place to start. In English, then the memorial address. I think there It's a text that Heidegger wrote with this specific audience of the people in Metzger, his hometown, in mind. So he's writing for people who he knew did not know anything about philosophy. So, and commentaries, I think you should always start with the text itself, and then maybe you can move into. So I'll first go to mouse and then go back to Louise. I think I think there are reasons why they would think of Heidegger as a religious thinker. Also through his reception in theology, which was pretty strong. I think for Protestantism of Bultmann, his colleague in Marburg, in the Catholic world, Karl Rahner, and even Pope John II, the Polish Pope, wrote about Heidegger, studied Heidegger as a student. So there is this religious overtone, and it may have to do also maybe a little bit also to his link to Schelling. But I think, of course, Heidegger himself, in a letter to Carl Lewis from 1921, calls himself a Christian theologian. He's the emphasis on the theologian. So there is a, it's this, yeah, of course, in what's called thinking, it's kind of a meditative text as well. So I can imagine that you would publish it in the religious series. But in a sense, it's also misleading because in the end, Heidegger is about thinking. Let's see, climate change. I don't think. I think Heidegger would probably say it's something I was already thinking about in my critique of technology, and that there is, as long as we are there, there's still hope. But we will need to make sure that this whole, and that's of course very hard to see. There maybe Klassenheit may be a notion that can help. You could say, some people say that you need a big revolution. So we have to overcome globalism, liberal capitalism, etc., etc. If you do it in a revolution, probably what will come out of it is the opposite of what you hope to be the result. So this notion of Gelassenheit, letting go and letting be, might be a more appropriate answer. You find it nowadays also in a lot of people, especially also younger people, say, I don't need a car anymore. Why should I get a university degree if it's going to put me in debt for the rest of my life? I don't need a big place. I will live in a tiny house. I want to make my ecological imprint on this planet as small as possible. So that's a kind of letting go. A lot of the things that we think are very important and self-evident, where younger people maybe see more clearly than we do. I think despair doesn't get you anywhere. Despair only leads to bad things. Desperate people do desperate things. I think maybe that's also in Heidegger, this notion of Jemeinigkeit, being your own mortal self, means that in the end you have responsibility for your life. And of course, a part of your life is your relation to other people. we're not born to save the world. I think we're born to lead decent lives based on what we know. And of course, everything we know is limited, and we have limited possibilities of freedom. So every choice you make implies making another choice not. This was where this notion of guilt comes from. So I think that's also the idea behind this other thing I'm trying to get off the ground. You could say this place for another kind of thinking and dwelling. So if we dwell a little bit differently on this planet, it already makes a difference. If people start doing it and take responsibility for their own lives and their own ecological imprint, and that might be steps in the right direction. So, what film of these late days would you relate to Heidegger's philosophy? That's a difficult question. I think Malik, of course, has themes that sound very Heideggerian. And it also depends on how you read Heidegger and what Heidegger you want to play with. I think it's a bit similar to the question about Eliot. I think I don't think that Malik, you may have read Heidegger, you even studied Heidegger, but in your filmmaking, you leave that behind you. You try to create something, a work of art, basically. And I think then it's an interesting subject to think about. If you take a close look at the films and the way they are structured and the thematic approach, if you can find, if you could shed light on them from Heidegger's thinking, I think that would be the way to do it, in my opinion. I've done it myself, not with a movie. I did it with Sally Mann's photography. Try to show how some of the thoughts of Heidegger come to light in photographs. But it's another story. Then we get, of course, the student Christian movement press. It's, of course, think about it. One of the most important books of the 20th century in philosophy, Being in Time, is published by the student Christian movement press. In a sense, it's incredible. Heidegger versus Nietzsche. I think the problem is, of course, that I think maybe what gets embedded is the playfulness. I think that I'm guilty of that as well. I must as well, because it's hard to do. But I think there is the relationship between Heidegger and Nietzsche is also evolving. You could say it starts already very early, when Heidegger is completely critical of Nietzsche as a kind of antichrist. And he's also saying, well, Nietzsche went mad, and that already shows that he could not have had the truth, because the truth will lead to freedom and good life and not to a bad life. So, and then, of course, Nietzsche disappears for basically 10, 20 years. And he gets back, he begins to pop up again after being in time, I think. And then you find the more positive remarks on Nietzsche, and Heidegger then in 1936 starts giving his first lecture course on Nietzsche, and these 4 lecture courses that he's giving evolve, and his understanding of Nietzsche is not the same in each lecture course. There are other texts that seminars on Nietzsche that are important, I think, but that also you have to be aware both of the development of Heidegger thinking, and the problem is, of course, always that either you have people who read Nietzsche from a Heidegger perspective, or people who read Nietzsche as Nietzsche and are usually very critical of what Heidegger has to say. It's the same with Kant and Aristotle. So I would say you can do I would say, and then of course with the publication in 1961, I think, of the Nietzsche volumes, there's, of course, Heidegger puts on the table a 1,000-page book, which he worked on as well. Interesting enough, there was a first print of the volumes that Heidegger threw away, to the great chagrin of his publisher Nietzsche, because it was a very expensive move to just throw the first print away. He was not satisfied with the way it had come out. So that already shows Heidegger's own complex relation to Nietzsche. Interesting in that respect is also his work on the editorial board of the critical edition of Nietzsche from 1936 on. There were 5 or 6 volumes published before the whole project failed. And they are still, you can still buy them today. They have been reprinted. So. But it gave Heidegger insight into the manuscripts of Nietzsche, and also brought him in a close relationship with Karl Schlechter, who was working at the archive. And Heidegger used unpublished writings of Nietzsche in his lecture courses. So there's a huge amount of work to be done, I think, on the Nietzsche-Heidegger relation. And it's with this famous quote, most people say it came from Gadamer, but probably Elfriede told him that Heidegger once said, Nietzsche has destroyed me, hat mich kaputt gemacht. So that's something to follow up on. Some say unless you can read Heidegger, you don't read him. I think it's a bit of nonsense. I think basically you can translate even Heidegger into another language, which has its limitations in some ways, but sometimes it even helps to clarify things. I've been translating Heidegger into Dutch. I've even translated him into English, but it's you really read when you try to translate. To give an example, when the correspondence with his wife was going to be published in Dutch, I worked for a while with the guy who was doing the translation. And through translating the letters, we noticed that some things in the German could not be correct. So we sent an email with 3 or 4 of these examples to Gertrude Heidegger, who had edited the volume, and she looked again at the manuscripts and said, yeah, you're correct. So I think it also depends on what you want to do with it. I think if you want to be let's say a Heidegger specialist or a Heidegger researcher, if you feel the need to become one, then at some point you will need to be able to read German. And of course, first of all, because you have a lot of material that's only available in German and not in translation. So otherwise you will have to wait till all things are translated. And at the same time, you still want to work with unpublished things by Heidegger, you will have to read it in German as well. I think what people also forget, if you go to Marburg, for example, and you go to the Heidegger's Nachlass, and you ask for documents, you need to be able to read Heidegger's handwriting if it's something that's not been published. And if you can't read his handwriting, there's no point in going to Marburg. So it's the reason that I think it's important to keep that skill alive. It's a tool that people should learn how to use. I did a seminar on it. It's interesting. We did it in English, and we were working on a German text, but it still works. So I think it's possible to do both. If you want to get some feel of what Heidegger has been saying, you can read translations and it will give you an impression. So I think that's Uh, are there any films that influence your approach to philosophy? That's a good question. Uh, I don't know what to say, basically. I not so much my approach to philosophy. There are some movies that help me understand better what I thought philosophy should or could be. Uh, I'm getting away more and more from this traditional view that you have a canon of philosophical text and that you need to work on. If you know what's in those texts, you can reproduce it. But that is what being a philosopher is. To me, it's not. It has to do also with your own existence. So, and then there are movies that make you wonder or show things in a different light than you saw them in before. And that may help keep you going in your path of thinking. But basically, it's nice to write your own stuff, but at the same time, I'm pretty well. But I know that Heidegger as a thinker is a far deeper thinker than I am myself or will ever be. So juggling the two, I try to learn to think as well as I can through following Heidegger on his path of thinking and opening up this path of thinking to other people. I think we always need people to do that, and it is a task that will be more difficult in the future because of the whole change of the way education works, of the way we read now, the influence of the internet, of e-books. So I think there's a lot of challenges in that respect waiting for us. And of course, that are mostly topics that philosophers will not think about. Philosophy professors. I think that's why we need to be innovative. It's a reason to try things like this. Talk on YouTube and try to reach another audience. And if we can find some people each time, and maybe if I look now, there must be some 10 people listening. Well, maybe if I do it again, there will be 15. Who knows? People say, well, it's kind of nice to attend for a couple of hours this kind of thing. And it's less of an obligation than participating in a seminar. Let's see. Well, the whole Nachlass will be opened after 70 years after Heidegger's death, so in 2046. Everything will be open to the public because then the copyright expires. But I think the family will still try to keep a grip on it. And, I think for now, Ulf Heidegger will do it, and he will probably still be there for 30 years or something. So then we get very close to the date that the whole thing will be opened up. And instead of being creative with it and making it, use it to further Heidegger research or to further the interest in Heidegger's work, they're keeping it on the restricted. I think openness is always a better way to go. I mean, I have a lot of ideas and things you could have done. I've shared them also with Ulf, but he doesn't like to do it. Simplest example is a critical edition of Being and Time. I think there should be one text edition of Being and Time that would be the standard for all future Heidegger research, where you can find all the differences between the different editions, and you can also find all the marginalia that Heidegger wrote in several different copies of Being and Time he worked with. So what's the relevance of Heidegger for us today? The question is, well, we can ignore Heidegger and continue our current path of destruction. I think most people are quite happy to do that. I think But we should not care about Heidegger, we should care about his thinking. And I think his thinking can help us understand why we're on a path of destruction. So in that sense, I think Heidegger is still relevant today. And he sees it on a far deeper level than most other critics. Because it's in Heidegger, you have there's an ontological foundation. You can see, like he likes to say, the problem. The problem of physics. Let's see how I can put it in the correct way. The essence of technology is nothing technical. So it's a way of how we disclose to the world, to put it simple. And if we disclose the world, then everything that's in it, all the entities and beings, as something that is makeable and we can do with what we like. And then you end up with this global capitalism, I would say. We just destroy, if we need wood, we destroy a forest. And if we want to build a new motorway, we destroy whatever is in our path. And we don't think about the consequences. So I think there we can still listen and learn from Heidegger to see that it has to be, it has to do with the way we disclose our world, understand ourselves, even we begin to understand ourselves as something makeable. We would like to be as makeable as possible. If you don't like your face, you can get a new one. And we don't want to die, so if we can find a way of living much longer, then we will do it. So I think that's where Heidegger can make a difference. That he can help us understand that we need to disclose the world in a different way, and that's something that he uses this notion of Klassenheit for. That we try to let beings be and listen to the way they address us. And that a chicken has something to say to us. It's not just a machine to produce eggs and sell eggs at the most compatible price and make as much money as you can. If you look at it goes for human beings, of course, even stronger. If you look at the children working in mines, you use them only as labor, and you don't see them as human beings. I think Heidegger is there in that respect is very helpful because he makes us look and in the eye. Let's see, seeing confused dialectics. Yes, I think it was well, of course, it's rewarding to. I think there's an example. There was a priest from Nigeria doing his dissertation on Heidegger on the existential structure of Dasein. And of course, he told me a couple of interesting things. I think there are 156 different languages in Nigeria. There are 3 main languages. About 60% of the population speak one language. Then there is 35% that speak a second language, and there's about 10% that speak a third language, and the rest speak all these little different languages. He said, one thing he said, well, the experience of time for people in Nigeria is very different. They have no understanding of the future. The future is tomorrow, or in exceptional cases, the day after tomorrow. But they don't think in years and plan ahead for the next 4 years and things like that. So that in itself is already interesting and revealing, I think, and makes you rethink maybe the existential structure that Heidegger describes in Being in Time World, to see that it can work out very differently in its historical context or its cultural context. And that's one of the reasons if they get paid. If I have money now, so if I have money, I go to the beach and have a nice time. And when I have no money anymore, I go back to the factory and start working again. But that, of course, doesn't work. in our modern system of production. That's why we domesticate children already in school, being on time, working hours, and etc. etc. And you can ask yourself if that's really the best way of living our lives. And the other thing you wanted to do is you wanted to use the existential structure of Dasein to make young people in Nigeria understand that money isn't everything. Basically meaning that not all the boys should be drug dealers and not all the girls should be prostitutes. There are other values in life that are more important than money. So I think that's one way of translating Heidegger into a relevance for people today. Do you think there are anything about Heidegger worth thinking of? What's in Heidegger sense? I think metaphysics has basically continued. Of course, there's always the other side of analytic philosophy, which is growing stronger and stronger, and is basically wiping out what Heidegger would call philosophy. Well, I think there's a simple problem. There's a simple thing with philosophy. If you want to earn your keep as a philosopher, nowadays you can only teach, or you have to be somebody who has so much money that you don't need to work for your money anymore. Most people need to get to earn some money to be able to live. So that makes it. It's all pushed into a framework. It's not just philosophy. It's the whole system of university nowadays. It's not about what the Germans would call Bildung, but it's only Ausbildung. So it's not about developing yourself as a person, a human being, but it's acquiring skills and getting a paper that proves that you have acquired the skills so you can make money in businesses. I don't think Heidegger is doing theology in the absence of God. That would make very little sense to Heidegger. Theology presupposes the existence of God and being present of God. As he said already in 1927 in this talk about phenomenology and theology, that the task of theology is to reinterpret the word of God so it can speak in our time. And that's basically something he was working on when he was still a student of theology. He was doing something similar, and that's where this notion of being a Christian theologian comes from, I think. But in his Heidegger is in that sense like Nietzsche and even Heidegger. It's the experience of the absence of God, which brings nihilism to light. And Nietzsche is searching for God. And Heidegger talks about the gods that have fled. And for Heidegger, it belongs to modernity that God is dead, which doesn't mean that a God has died, but that he's lost his relevance in our everyday life. That's why Heidegger, especially in the late 30s, in contributions, etc., is looking for this coming God, or keeping open the possibility that if there ever comes a God again, he can still address us and we're still capable of hearing an address that is not metaphysical. That's a pretty long story to develop in 2 minutes. Is it possible that the major change in? I think the major change in Heidegger's style, I think it's not so much in the. It has to do with, I think, two things. When he becomes aware that the completion of metaphysics is nihilism, the planetary domination of technology, as he later calls it, in the 50s. He sees the need for developing a non-metaphysical kind of thinking. And if you want to think, you need language. So it also means finding a non-metaphysical way of speaking. That's something you can see him struggle with, and it starts already in the Black Notebooks. That's one of the running themes in the Black Notebook that, in my opinion, have been overlooked to a large extent. But it's the struggle with language, and thus also with thinking. And then, of course, you can see it I think in the contributions to philosophy, he's trying to think against metaphysics. So he's always aware that there's a danger slipping back into the language of metaphysics. But as long as you keep thinking against metaphysics, you're still dependent on metaphysics. That's why he later, I think he drops this project of the contributions to philosophy and tries to develop his thinking then more from poetry and his interpretation of poets than as a kind of thinking against something. Any form of anti is always dependent on what it is anti against. Anti-capitalism presupposes capitalism. Otherwise, there's no sense. Anti-Semitism presupposes Semitism. So it's and then the next thing that changes is when Heidegger basically is no longer a university professor, and he's no longer addressing mainly an audience of students, but he begins to speak to people. What in Germany, the cultured people who know their German literature, who have had some experience of philosophical thinking, and that's why his language is also changing. He's constructing it more and more as every lecture is passive thinking. And on this passive thinking, he wants to bring people to an experience of thinking. It's only just the experience of thinking. It's not teaching you how to think for yourself as much as it was earlier. I think the Black. I think Heidegger kept using these Black Notebooks. So it's. I still haven't read the 100, I must admit. So. But it's still a kind of preparation for things that he will work out in papers or lectures and maybe even books. So I think that's the purpose of writing the Black Notebooks. It's, first of all, just writing for himself with no audience in mind. And then when he has written out certain things, he can say, well, have a look. Can I put it, can I use it in a lecture? And something you find in this discussion when he's about to publish a book and people are proofreading. It's he's often saying, is it not too difficult? Is it not going too far? Or I don't want to say this already. So it's a way of gathering thoughts, developing thoughts. Would you approve of them being published? Well, as long as you don't destroy it, in principle, you agree with everything being published. And he did destroy quite a few things in his life, and correspondences and things. I think the way they were published might be a bit of a problem for him. I'm not even completely sure. If it would have been up to me, I would have published them outside of the Gesamtausgabe. But that's. But it's a way also to make money, the Gesamtausgabe. Because you have subscribers who will take any volume that's published. You probably will sell more copies if you publish them in the Gesamtausgabe than you do that outside. Well, to make it more clear, the best example is GA 16. Is Reden und andere Zeugnisse eines Lebensweges. which was edited by Heidegger himself. I think that it's in the first section of the Gesamtausgabe published writings, but let's say not to exaggerate, 85% or 90% is unpublished. And of course, he included a lot of these writings of Heidegger, letters as rector during 33, 34. I think it would have been much better to publish it outside of the Gesamtausgabe for several reasons. One reason is that they have this strange rule that you cannot comment in the Gesamtausgabe. So it seems that everything he's saying in some of these more obscure texts and politically problematic texts is simply acceptable to the people who are publishing the Gesamtausgabe. If you would do it outside, then you could say, well, we have a commentary, you put it in the historical context, you could do different things with it that you can't do within the Gesamtausgabe. And the other thing is, of course, when it was published, we found still a lot of stuff that Herman Heidegger didn't include, didn't find before we found it. So we have a lot of other documents in volume 4 of the Heidegger article, which is about 400 pages. That should then also have been in GA16, basically. So if you leave it outside, it's also easier to work with. So new things show up, you can always say, well, we do a small additional volume with Heidegger's writings, 1933, 1936, whatever. And you could always extend it. And of course, if you think about it in our context today, there would be a lot to say for publishing things on the internet. An example is this, what will be left after the Gesamtausgabe is finished is about 20,000 notes of Heidegger, which are just collected in boxes, which I think would be a good project to do on the internet. So Marbach would need somebody to scan all the notes. Sometimes it's just a word, sometimes it's maybe a short section of 20 lines or something. You could publish it then on the internet and say, well, this is the scan, and people can do a transcription, or you could pay somebody to do a first transcription, and people could then compare the scans and the transcriptions and look for mistakes and things like that. And you could also then try to find pieces that belong together. Maybe there are 5, 6 notes. If you put them together, they give a longer text, or you can try to date them based on the handwriting. It's also something is possible, and that would be a creative thing of going about it. And you could always say, and then you can always say, well, we're not keeping anything back because we're publishing everything, but we're not going to publish it in a book, but we're publishing it in a more fluid form. And then when everything is done, 10, 15 years later, you can always say, okay, we're now going to publish maybe 500 copies of 3 volumes, mainly for our libraries, so that this text is secure. A book is still a more secure way of preserving a text than anything you do on the internet, digital. Herman Heidegger was qualified. He thought he was qualified. I think that's where a lot of the problems come from. That he wasn't qualified. And it is always the same trick. If people would say, "Why are you doing it in this way?" then you could always claim, "Well, my father told me to." Although in several cases, I'm convinced that his father never told him to do it this way. That's up to different people. It's not my decision, not my problem in that sense. Let's see. I think we're more or less coming to an end of this. I will put the Zoom link in the chat. So if there are no further questions, I mean, we close this bit, and we can move to Zoom, and I'll show the movie that Jörg made of the celebrations for Heidegger's 70th birthday, both in Freiburg and then later in Mesquite. it's not on the internet. So if you're interested in having a look, you can find it, look at it. There's still one more question from Nikolai August. I think it's Achim, probably. Well, the family, that's a story in itself. There's a lot of animosity, I think, in the family. And it's already starting between Jörg and Herman. That played a role when they were both already old men. And the way the things were handled. Jörg Heidegger was politically active for the Liberal Party. He was a member of the City Council of Treddingen for the FDP. Well, Herman Heidegger is, of course, more right-wing than his brother was. So that's already a difference. Anyway, I have to thank you, of course, for taking the time to listen to me talking. If you have any other questions, or you can always send me an email or contact me on Facebook. Otherwise, I'll try to stop this, and I've opened already the Zoom, so you can slip in to Zoom, and I'll see you there in a couple of minutes, and then we'll get to move. So thanks again, and have a nice Sunday tomorrow, and a nice rest of the Saturday as well. So, bye-bye.